All right. Welcome again officially. My name is Mary Beth Gassman, and I'm a professor at Rutgers University, and I'm really, really excited to be with you today. This event is sponsored by the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice at Rutgers, and I have the honor of being the executive director of the Proctor Institute, and we get to sponsor many, many wonderful events like the one today. We have two panelists with us today, and they are Magdalena Barrera, who is the Vice Provost for Faculty Success at San Jose State University, and Genevieve Negrón-Gonzales, who is Professor of Leadership Studies at the University of San Francisco. And they are here today to talk about their new book, The Latinx Guide to Graduate School. If you haven't read it, you really need to read it. It is wonderful, so personable, and so practical, which is exactly what we need in order to make sure that people succeed. The way that today's event will work is that Magdalena and Genevieve are going to give a presentation on the book for a little while, and then we are going to have a little bit of Q&A back and forth with myself and them, and then we are going to open it up for questions. So please put your questions in the Q&A. We hope you have lots and lots of questions. We have two amazing experts with us, and we hope that you ask questions. We have ample time to be able to do that. I also wanted to say that we are going to be giving out a discount code for the book, which will allow you to save 30% directly from Duke University Press. And we are also raffling off 3 autographed copies of the book. And I will mention this again at the end, but I wanted everyone to know that here at the beginning of our webinar. So I am going to now hand it over to Magdalena and Genevieve. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Mary Beth. We're really, really happy to be here. Want to first just start by saying thank you to all of the folks, Mary Beth, Giselle, all the folks who planned and worked and put the event together today. My name is Genevieve Negrón-Gonzales, and I'm really, really happy to be here. I know we're talking to a mix of folks. Some of you may be graduate students, some of you may be thinking about graduate school, some of you may be faculty and staff working with graduate students. And, you know, the book has been out in the world for about 7 months now. And it's just been such an honor to travel via Zoom to different places, share the work with folks and hear feedback and thoughts, and really just open up this conversation, which is such an important conversation to be having in the Academy. So I'll pass the baton to my co-author to introduce herself, and then we'll jump in.
Hi, everyone. My name is Magdalena Barrera. Again, I'm Vice Provost for Faculty Success, San Jose State. Like Genevieve, just really honored to be in conversation with you all, and thank you to Mary Beth and the team for supporting us in this and helping to spread the word about our book, which we're so excited about and is something that has been really meaningful to work on. So what we have planned is Genevieve and I will each share a little bit of our personal backgrounds, how we came together, a real quick overview of the book, and then we want to share with you 5 main takeaways from the book, and then looking forward to Q&A. So let's get started.
So, we start with some context for who we are and where we come from, because in many ways, that's also the story of the book, is our own journeys through graduate school, our own journeys before graduate school that led us on the path to thinking about teaching and mentoring in the ways that we do, which led to the creation of this book project. And so when we start with our own personal stories and our own trajectories, it's partially about situating us and situating ourselves, in part because part of what we draw on in the book is our own experiences navigating the institution, but also because for all of us, our origin stories are so much about the way that we approach the work that we do. And we think it's important to encourage folks to think in that way, students to think in that way, to talk in that way about how we approach this work. So this is a little snapshot into where I come from. You'll see there on the upper left corner, that's a picture of the U.S.-Mexico border, and it's a picture particularly of the stretch along the San Isidro border crossing, which is the part of the border that is in South San Diego County in Tijuana. This is one of the busiest land crossings in the world. And this is where I grew up, just a few miles away on the U.S. Side of the border. That's a picture of me when I was small and a little bit of a troublemaker and very curious, which I think comes through in this picture. I share this because I was a first generation college student. I grew up on the border during a very particular time on the border. I was a teenager in the 90s, which meant that I was coming to political consciousness and my own sense of self and my identity, while there were some really horrific conditions at the border and targeting and violence against migrants. This fundamentally shaped who I am. It shaped the way that I do my work. It shaped my own sort of entry and research in the academy. It in many ways shaped my entire political, personal, academic, and intellectual trajectory. Is growing up in this moment, seeing this, being at the same time that curious child who had a sense from early on that things didn't need to be this way, that things were happening that I didn't quite have the language to describe at that point, but I knew deep inside, in part coming from a Mexican Catholic family, that like we deserved better, that things didn't need to be this way, and that ultimately culminated in my own sort of educational trajectory. I landed at UC Berkeley as an undergraduate student, right in the midst of the fight to save affirmative action. I was in the last class admitted with affirmative action to UC Berkeley. I'm a proud beneficiary of affirmative action, and really stepping into a campus that was enmeshed in that struggle, really in many ways sort of calibrated the entirety of my educational experience. I returned to UC Berkeley for my master's and my PhD. I have my degrees in social and cultural studies and education. And as you can see from these pictures, when Magdalena and I were first putting together these slides to share our own trajectories, she said, can you pull up some slides from when you were in graduate school? And I have no pictures from when I was in graduate school, because I had 2 kids when I was in graduate school. I had my son right on the cusp of finishing my master's. I had my daughter right on the cusp of finishing my PhD. And I was a flurry of, I was working nearly full time most of that time. I was a flurry of work and babies and diapers and passing the babies off on the subway platform to my partner as he was sort of zipping off to work and I was zipping in the opposite direction. So these are basically 3 of the photos that I have during that period of time. One when I was pregnant, and like, as I said, on the cusp of finishing my PhD. And then the others at my graduation. And when I graduated, I had a 4-year-old and a 8-month-old. And, I share this in part because in many ways, I did graduate school really differently than often is talked about in the books. I approached things differently. My life circumstances were different than what we think of in terms of sort of what a traditional graduate student looks like. And at the same time, I was at this very traditional sort of elite institution, which was UC Berkeley, and trying to navigate sort of this disconnect there. There were 3 things that stand out from my time in graduate school. One is that I was deeply ambivalent, and I was ambivalent pretty much the entire time. I loved what I was doing. I loved the engagement. I loved the thinking. And I also was pretty turned off by the elitism. I was pretty ambivalent. I struggled with my own trajectory, my own contributions. I was struggling with this idea of, did I really belong here? Was I smart enough to be here? I was also truthfully struggling with the question of like, is this what my community needs from me? I went to graduate school because I was motivated by the idea of doing this work that would speak meaningfully to the conditions in my community. And as I was in the institution, I struggled to make sense of if that was really the right thing to do, if that's really what I needed to be doing, or if I should be, returning to the work that I was doing in the community in terms of grassroots organizing and consciousness building. So yeah, that's the first thing that stood out from my graduate years, is that I was pretty deeply ambivalent. The second thing is that those years were really marked by me really running afoul of unwritten rules in pretty fundamental ways, right? As I already said, I had kids, I was working. What that meant is that I was sort of marked with a persistent feeling of otherness during my period in the institution. And that at times made me frustrated. At other times, it made me feel like I really didn't belong here. And I contemplated walking away numerous times. And the third thing that really marked this period is it really marked a moment in which I came into myself as a writer, as a thinker, as a scholar, as an educator. I began to imagine a future for myself in the academy. I began to understand and think about the way that research and writing and scholarship can actually shift conditions on the ground in meaningful ways. And I share this in part because I want to really draw out the point that all of these things happen simultaneously. It's not like I dealt with the imposter syndrome and then sort of set that aside and then I was able to come into myself. All of these things, the outsiderness, the otherness, the ambivalence, the empowerment, all of that was happening simultaneously, and really in many ways contributed to the ways that I think about graduate education and the way that I approach my own mentorship work to this day. And at that point, that these pictures were taken, if you had said that I would eventually become full professor, that I would make my home in the academy, I think even at that point of graduation day, I wouldn't have really believed that. But I've been blessed to be able to make a home in an institution that is hospitable to this kind of community engaged scholarship and work. And all of these experiences really ultimately shaped who I am, the way that I think about mentoring and teaching, the way that I approach the work with my own students, and ultimately contributed to the collaboration with my colleague Magdalena and the writing of this book.
Thanks, Genevieve, for sharing your story. And we get to the next slide. I can tell you a little bit about mine. I grew up in a very different place in the Midwest. I'm the granddaughter of Mexican immigrants to the U.S. Midwest. My grandfathers were traqueros. They were hired to work on railroads and came up through Kansas City first from central Mexico and then continued on to Chicago. By the time I came around, my parents had moved to a predominantly white suburb of Chicago. It's called Bolingbrook, where I was always the only Mexican girl in all of my classes. And I'm struck by Genevieve sharing part of her story is that feeling of otherness, right? Having a kind of different narrative as she moved through her undergraduate and graduate education. And it strikes me that, right, I was someone for whom, being a good student was like my job in the family. My parents didn't expect me to work after school or to do other things. It was like, you just focus on school. And so being the good student was the main way that I saw myself, right? And when I got to graduate school and had full funding and, didn't do other things, I wasn't married, I didn't have a family, right? And still that otherness is still there for those of us who are like doing like the kind of typical way that you think grad school is supposed to look. So I'm always just struck by that. Like Genevieve, I was a first-gen college student. When I was in high school, my senior year, there was a TV show called Class of '96 that I used to watch religiously because it was about a group of college freshmen navigating their first year of college. And I was like, okay, I'm taking notes here because this is what college is going to be like. I ended up at the University of Chicago. I wanted to major in English. I aspired to be a writer because reading Sandra Cisneros's House on Mango Street when I was in high school was a transformative moment for me. I'd been an avid reader, but that was the first time I had ever seen a Mexican girl at the center of the story with a family that looked and sounded like mine, with living in a place that I recognized, right, in Chicago. But I was also really hungry to learn about the histories of colonialism and race that I knew had shaped my family's story, but that my education hadn't ever given me the language to talk about. So I also found my way to a double major in Latin American studies. In that time, I found elite academic culture to be extremely jarring. It left me with terrible habits of procrastinating on my writing, something I struggle with to this day, feeling that I was never measuring up. And this was a thing that I aspired to do, was central to my identity. Like, I'm a writer and this is something I want to pursue, but I just fundamentally don't feel at home doing that. What helped me get through undergrad was being tracked into the Mellon Minority Undergraduate Fellowship, now called the Mellon Mays, having key mentorship from the one Chicano professor that University of Chicago had in the English department at the time, one Latina grad student that was there and really reached out to me, and also being part of a Latino student group, the one that we had on campus during that time. I took a year off after undergrad and then continued to the PhD program in modern thought and literature at Stanford. And that's what brought me out here to California. I knew what I wanted to study, to look at representations of Mexicans in early 20th century American literature, music, and photography. And, I was excited about that. It was connected to my family story. I felt like I want to understand the world that my grandparents first encountered when they came to the US and to understand how they were likely seen and talked about. But I found that while I did really well in my classes, well, there was a clear structure set out for me, clear assignments, due dates, organized by the professor, I really floundered when it came to writing my dissertation and being on my own. So some of the pictures I have here, right, represent to me two modes of being that I had when I was in grad school. One was like really having a good time socializing, building a social network, partying hard, undergrad style at times, I think out of a sense of anxiety and feeling out of control. But then also, this other photo is me on the day of my oral exam. It was the first time I had ever worn a suit. And I got to the exam room early and asked a friend to take a photo of me. And it feels like when I look at this picture, I see it as a performance, right? Here's someone who is trying on this identity and trying very hard to look like, yes, I belong here. I'm professional. I know exactly what I'm doing. But always when I look at my hands, I see how nervous my body language is, right? If you look closely. I decided to walk through my graduation as a way to motivate myself to finish the dissertation. So you see me here with my nuclear immediate family. And there's a smile on my face, but a real terror inside because I wasn't done writing. I didn't know how I would complete the dissertation. I was suffering a terrible writer's block. And I didn't know if academia was for me. I'd been training for 7 years to be preparing for a tenure track. And I was at this point where I felt like my teaching is nothing to write home about, and the writing is not what I thought it would be. So I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. It felt like a quarter life crisis. I almost left academia at that point, but I ended up applying for and getting accepted to a teaching postdoc, also at Stanford, that was renewable for up to 3 years. And my motivation to accept it was, okay, now I got a 3-year window of income to figure out my career path. But that was my first real teaching experience. And I discovered that it's not that I don't want to be in academia, it's that I need to find a teaching-centered institution that would be the right fit for me. And I landed at San Jose State University, which is part of the California State University system, in 2008. And I've learned here so many things from my students and colleagues. And I began to focus my research more on how Latinx and other historically underrepresented scholars navigate higher education, right? So like Genevieve kind of saying, like, if you had told me back then the kind of work I would be doing now, the perspective I would have to be in a role now leading faculty as they navigate their careers, I never would have imagined this when I was like taking my notes, watching Class of 96 back in the day. But it's been a really meaningful journey, and I'm so proud that it's led to this book. And Genevieve will share a little bit of how we got connected and started this together.
Thanks, Magdalena. Yeah, so, Magdalena and I met at San Jose State University. I was in the final stages of my doctoral program. She was a starting out assistant professor, and she was, in her tenure track position at San Jose State. I came as an adjunct professor in the Department of what was then called Mexican American Studies. And we were teaching the same students. We were teaching separate classes, but this was the same cohort of students who would take her class like on Tuesday night and my class on Wednesday night or something like that. And as we got to know each other, we developed a personal connection and a professional relationship around sort of supporting and mentoring students, right? So we were seeing sort of the students, many of whom were, Latinx, many of whom were first generation, many of whom were sort of trying to navigate graduate school with very few resources, with very little understanding. And we're really looking to faculty members like us for not only guidance in their classes, but sort of guidance broadly as they navigated their programs. And we began to sort of lean on each other and reach out to each other. Hey, this student is working on this, for their thesis topic. And, I was suggesting to her that she read this, do you have any other suggestions? Or, hey, what do you think about this particular student who seems to be struggling with these things? Let's check in about this to see how we can support him. And so we developed sort of this point of connection, realizing we had a real shared approach to mentoring and guiding and supporting graduate students. After a couple of years, I moved on to my position, my tenure track position at the University of San Francisco. Magdalena was continuing on her path at San Jose State. And though we were no longer teaching the same students, we would continue to reach out to each other to sort of, get some thoughts, get some ideas, brainstorm together about ways that we could best support our students. A few years ago, a mutual colleague of ours who we both know independently Kathleen Cole, who is one of my colleagues at the University of San Francisco, she reached out to both of us independently and said, "Hey, I'm looking for like a book to give to brand new, Latinx graduate students. Do you know of anything that exists?" And I said, I don't know that I've ever seen anything like that. Let me take a look around, and I'll let you know if I find something. And she said, yeah, I'm going to ask Magdalena as well. But if that kind of book doesn't exist, you two should really write it. And we kind of laughed and moved on. And then, whatever, a week later, Magdalena and I were talking, and we, shared that Kathy had both talked with us about this. And then we said, I don't know, what do you think? Should we write this book? And what we committed to at that point was to sit down, to share a meal, and to like imagine the possibility of what a book like this could be. And by the end of that, 2-hour sit down meal, we had like the table of contents. We were splitting it up. We were like, it was basically, the book was starting to be written. And I think the impetus in so many ways was us thinking about, this is a way for us to really in a fundamental way kind of get down what it is that we do when we are working with students, the kind of advice that we're giving, the kind of mentorship that we are trying to impart. And it's also a way for us to think about getting this out in the world, to think more broadly with more people collaboratively about what it means to really support Latinx graduate students as faculty members, how Latinx graduate students could see themselves in graduate education, and in many ways, the rest is history.
Right, so to give you a quick overview of the book, if you're not familiar with it, we cover everything from whether or not to go to grad school, how do you find the right programs, how do you really research them and understand what you're getting into, how do you prepare to enter that. We provide essential skills for grad school around reading, note-taking, conferencing, writing at the graduate level. And we also provide a lot of advice around the hidden curriculum and what it means to be navigating this pathway. How do you make the most of the professional relationships you're here to build with faculty, with your peers in the program, with students whom you may be mentoring as a graduate student? But also recognizing you're not just a student, you also have a personal life. And so how do you navigate those familial relationships? Whether that's romantic partnerships, relationships with your parents, children, if you have them while you're in grad school. And then just like you had to prepare to enter it, how do you prepare to end this chapter of your journey and get ready for the next phase? We conclude with 5, we call them mandamientos, or commandments for remaking the academy, and include a really great chapter by Carolina Valdivia for undocumented students and what this journey looks like, particular FAQs, resources for folks who are undocumented and want to pursue advanced degrees. I do want to highlight the title of the introduction. I think gives you a sense of the way we approach this. You thought you were buying a how-to book, but ended up getting a love letter, manifesto, and flashlight, because our thinking is, right, this is not just another guide to graduate school. We're drawing on our Latinx cultural values, trying to give some real talk. What are the things that are opaque to us, because many of us are the first in our families to navigate this? There's also a multiplicity of voices. So we invited colleagues and some former students to share consejos, or pieces of advice that are interspersed throughout the chapters. So we really want to give the reader a feeling that there is a community of support that is waiting for you. You're not navigating this alone, and you have a lot of people cheering you on along the way. All right, so with that, let's get into our 5 takeaways, and Genevieve will share the first one.
So the first takeaway is that the academy was not created for people like us, right? It's steeped in legacies of classism and racism, not to mention other forms and systems of oppression. And nevertheless, there's meaningful redemptive work for us to do in this space of higher education. We start here and we end here in many ways, right? We really hope that readers take this away from the book, because we feel like it's important to give voice to this duality. So many Latinx graduate students and graduate students of various sort of marginalized backgrounds and from various marginalized communities come into the institution and in many ways almost immediately begin to feel that otherness, that outsiderness, right? And we think it's important to give voice to that. We think it's important to acknowledge, look, the institution itself it's steeped in elitism. It's steeped in these legacies of oppression. People like us were not intended to be here, right? The institution was not crafted to create access for people like us, right? And it's important to name that, because in the absence of naming it, what often happens is that students run into these barriers that are created by these legacies, right? Run into the barriers, and then they blame themselves, and they think that it must be that they're not enough, they're not smart enough, they're not capable enough, they're not actually meant to be here, right? And so in the absence of this sort of structural institutional frame, it can be really defeating. It can be a way that Latinx and other marginalized students find themselves fundamentally at odds with the institution, because it must be their fault. So we think it's important to name that, to acknowledge that, to not pretend like that's not the history of higher ed in this country, right? At the same time, we think it's really important to give sort of the rounded kind of sense of what it means to acknowledge this, right? There's a way that you can acknowledge this, understand this, feel this about what the institution is at its core, and say, all right, well, I mean, what am I really doing here then, right? If it's steeped in these legacies, then like maybe I shouldn't even be here, right? Maybe we should just kind of throw in the towel. And so for us, it's important to both acknowledge that, and also to say, there is meaningful, redemptive, important work for us to do in this space. There is something that is transformative fundamentally about higher education. So many of us have experienced that in our own lives, right? There's something fundamentally important and transformative, and we can't just cede that. We can't just say, it's steeped in these legacies, that means it's not for us. We need to be able to really be at home with that duality. There's something very generative, we believe, by naming that duality of both these deeply entrenched legacies of oppression, and also really owning the reality that there is important work to be done here. We are positioned to do that work, and it's too important to walk away from.
Before we get off the slide, I just want to point to our artwork that you'll see throughout this upcoming slides. They're done by an artist named Adriana Arriaga. She goes by Adriana La Artista. She did the cover art for the book. In fact, this was an alternate take on the cover that we considered, but all the artwork throughout is hers. She's an awesome graphic artist, and thank her for her permission to use her images. Okay, so our second takeaway is the reminder that master's and doctoral degrees are not an end in and of themselves. Rather, we have to see them as tools that help us work towards bigger, more meaningful change over the long term, right? And this gets back to the first takeaway about the redemptive work that there is for us to do. Like, okay, we're here in the space of higher ed. What are the kind of tools, the methods, the readings, the conversations we can be a part of that can help us think, not just in terms of, hey, I'm here to get this doctoral degree to complete, my master's thesis, to get the PhD, and then not have a vision beyond that, but rather, how do we start to see ourselves as people who have fundamental issues that draw us, intellectual questions that are really motivating, that are connected to what we see going on in our communities, in our families, helping us to confront some of the biggest challenges that we're facing today as a society, right? Speaking from my own personal experience, I was someone for whom, getting into grad school was like my short-term goal. And I didn't know, aside from, I'll become a tenure track professor, what was beyond that, right? And even that seems funny to me now, because it's not a foregone conclusion that you're going to get a tenure track job. And that's not the only thing that you can do with this degree. And when I was having my crisis at the end of my graduate program, feeling like I really don't know what I want to do, the reason why that caused so much stress was because I had only conceived of it in one way. I wasn't thinking of it and didn't receive support to really think about what are fundamentally the skills and tools that could apply to any number of career pathways that I can find really meaningful, because they're just other ways of exploring and getting at the same kinds of topics and important questions that are driving me to be here in the first place. right? So all this to say, especially for educators and advisors, how do we really help students stay rooted to the why that brought them to grad school, that inspired them to continue their education? What do these degrees mean? How do they want to apply them? And what are the diversity of ways that they can do so?
Moving on to the third takeaway. This is something that we feel like is really, really important. And it's something we sort of weave in through the book throughout. And it's important for students to hear. It's also important for folks who are supporting grad students to hear, right? The third takeaway is that succeeding in graduate school doesn't mean abandoning your family, your community, or your culture. You need to be who you are, right? And if we're to really embrace that idea, then what that means is that sometimes there will be rule breaking, right? That rule breaking is sometimes necessary, but that it's best to do that, to break those rules with your eyes wide open. What I mean by this is that, sort of related to the first 2 points, many first-gen students, Latinx graduate students, students from marginalized communities come into the institution, and there is, in most places, a normative white middle-class culture that is sort of the culture of higher education, right? And there's this way in which we can mistakenly think that succeeding in this space then must mean that we have to adopt that sort of normative culture, that we must acquiesce to that normative culture. And then by virtue of sort of who we are and where we come from, what that must mean then, right, is that success can only really be secured if we kind of abandon who we are, if we try to, tame our accents, if we try to dress in a way that looks like we belong. And we really want to communicate to students, it doesn't have to be that way, right? That walking this path is actually going to be enriched if you're able to really hold on to who you are, where you come from, and that succeeding in graduate education, in higher education, in the institution and the academy overall doesn't require us to surrender and relinquish who we are. And in fact, who you want to be at the end of this is somebody that you still feel like is you, that you still feel proud of, that you still feel comes from where you come from, and that actually can really be a source of strength and an asset as opposed to a liability. What that also means, though, is that there might be times that you run afoul of unwritten rules, right? And building on my own experience, I often tell students, and I talk about in the book, is that in my own experience, I sometimes realized that there were unwritten rules once I had broken them, right? It was only once I had broken them accidentally that I realized, oh, you're not supposed to do that. Oh, that's I tell a story in the book about bringing my young son to a talk that I wanted to attend on campus from a scholar that I admired, and I didn't want to miss out, and I didn't have childcare, and my son was 3, and if he had a snack in his lap, then he was good to go, in any context. So I set him up in the corner of the room. I gave him a snack. He was doing just fine. He was not disruptive, and a well-meaning faculty member kind of came over and whispered in my ear that I really shouldn't bring him to campus events if I wanted to be taken seriously as a scholar. I had no idea this was even a thing. I had no idea that this was something I should think about. I had no idea that people would perceive me in a particular way if I had my, well-behaved snacking kid in tow. And it really kind of threw me for a loop, in that period of time. I was about to go on the job market. And what I realized in reflecting on that and in talking with other folks was, actually, I'm not going to leave him at home. I am going to continue to bring him and with snack. And I'm going to continue to bring him because I actually think that this is a convention in the academy that's worth breaking. But also, I don't want to stumble into this, right? I don't want to do this accidentally. I want to be able to say, like, no, actually, he's doing just fine, and I brought him for this reason. I think it's important for students to hear that it is that being yourself sometimes will require some rule breaking, but if we can do that in ways that are aware and conscious, then it allows us to sort of take pride in those kinds of decisions, as opposed to feeling like we stumbled backwards accidentally into a hole that we didn't realize was there.
Yeah, our fourth takeaway is that grad school is an opportunity to become a specialist within an academic field, right? You may be motivated to attend a master's or PhD program because you've got those intellectual questions and things that you're like, hey, I want to, this topic is just so amazing. I can read and write about it forever and talk about it forever. You're jazzed about that. But let's not lose sight of the fact that it's also an opportunity to cultivate and practice core skills, habits, and how to create accountability structures that can sustain us mentally and physically as we engage in the work, right? And really that work is, how do we undertake a long-term project, right? In the case of, say, a thesis or a dissertation, a really large and long-term writing project. What does that look like in the day-to-day, right? How do you break that topic down into the bite-sized pieces that it's like, okay, today I'm going to work on, the introduction to chapter 4 or whatever. And it's about knowing yourself as an intellectual and a cultural worker, right? When do I work best? Am I a morning person? Am I an evening person? Am I someone who needs to have the absolute silence and be in the library and a carrel and zoom in? Do I need hustle and bustle? And it's better for me to work at a cafe and just hear other voices around me. How long can I really focus before taking a break? And then what are the breaks that really help me kind of separate and invigorate myself so that I could return to the project refreshed, whether it's later that day, the next day, a week from now, or whatever. It's like there's all these practical how-to aspects of earning a degree that sometimes are not addressed very openly within the classroom. I don't think I ever had a faculty member really walk me through, hey, here's my approach to tackling a difficult text. Here's how I have learned to take notes or to keep track of, where my mind is headed as I do different readings or engage in conversation. How can we make some of those more transparent? And to me, this is also a key piece of disrupting academic cultural norms of busyness and overwhelm, right? Whenever you ask anyone on campus, how are you doing, right? 99% of the time, the answer is like, oh my God, I'm so busy, another semester. How do we really take a break from that? What are the other pieces around us, and who are the folks who also ground us and help us feel like, yeah, this work is tough, but I can continue this. I have the support around me. I know what I need to tackle this little bit that I've assigned to myself for the day. It's really hard to figure that out, right? And as a grad student, I didn't have a sense of, it felt like the readings alone were tough enough. I should know how to do these other how-to aspects because I'm here. And if I don't know how to do them, again, it's like, okay, something's wrong with me then. And then I don't want to talk about it with the faculty member, when really this is an ongoing journey, and it's a long time sometimes to discover, yeah, this is what I need. If I'm going to meet this deadline and write this piece, these are the other parts of my life that I need to organize so that I can make that goal.
And moving on to the fifth takeaway, right, is this idea that graduate school does not have to be a lonely, painful endeavor, right? You can and should do it in community through seeking mentors, being a mentor, and disrupting individualistic notions of success. This is one of the things that we hope folks really, really take away from the book, right? There is this perception that, again, being a successful graduate student means that you're like holed up in the library all by yourself with like dimly lit, environment, and like pouring through books, lonely and sad and by yourself and in the dark, right? And what we really, really want to communicate is that there is a community of folks who are cheering you on. We want to make sure the students know that actually going through the process and the experience with and in community actually makes it so much better. And so many of our ideas about sort of having to go through this process in a solitary way are really rooted in sort of these individualistic notions of success that we want to disrupt anyhow, right? And so this idea of how do we, through our own engagement in the institution, remake the university, remake higher ed through our own thinking about sort of disrupting these individualistic notions of success, right? What does it mean to choose collaboration over competition whenever possible? What does it mean to choose, connection over competition? What does it mean to think in active ways about how is it that I build and foster a community in this space, not just for myself, but for the people who are coming behind me, right? How is it that we can think about our own location in the institution as a part of a legacy of scholars who have come before me? How is it that in thinking about that way of it really being a community of scholars, a community of folks, that we're not only enriching our own experiences, but that we're also pushing the institution in ways that we think it needs to grow, right? And that there's some very like concrete, practical implications of that, like, you know, join study groups, form study groups, reach out to your professors, like, you know, be connected and find connections. And then there's also sort of the bigger, broader visioning of that in terms of how it is that we think about our own role, not just as participants in, you know, academia, but as those who, through our own participation, are actively remaking the context of the institution as it exists.
And so with that, we just want to say we're looking forward to engaging in Q&A, and we want to emphasize that the conversation doesn't have to end today at the end of this webinar. We welcome you to contact us via email if you've maybe already read the book. We would love to get your thoughts on it. If you're interested in exploring more, again, please reach out. We've got the 30% off discount code when ordering from Duke University Press. And again, thank you to our my former student Adriana for such lovely artwork. You know, like when we saw the cover art come together and represent just different experiences, the different cultures that are under the umbrella of Latinx, it was a really just emotional and powerful moment. And that's what this ride has really felt like of working on this book. And so with that, yeah, we look forward to your questions and thoughts.
All right. Thank you so much. That was really, really good. I'm very excited to ask some questions. And I wanted to say that I think the line that was stated that really hit me was that it's more than a book. It's a love letter, a manifesto, and a flashlight. And wow, that I think that's what so many people need. And I'm so excited about all the people who are with us today, because I think it's just great to have a book like that. And then the other thing I wanted to say is that you know, I was also told the thing about, why is your kid here? You know, pulled aside, and you look unprofessional. You look like you're not a serious scholar. And I thought, wow, and I'm in an ed school, you know? So I remember when I was a young faculty member, and I just thought, I'm in an ed school. And it was interesting, because it was an older scholar who came up to me one day, who studied child psychology, and he got down on the ground and started talking to my daughter. And when he got up, I said, oh, wow, you know, you didn't chastise me. And he said, don't ever let anybody do that. Right. Don't ever let anybody tell you that your child doesn't belong. And so from that point forward, I took my daughter to everything, and I didn't really care. So anyway, I've got some questions, and then oh yeah, we got questions coming in the chat too. So the first one I wanted to ask is something that comes up in relation to the topic at hand is imposter syndrome. And is that something that you delve deeply into in the book, or do you think it's helpful for Latinx students, graduate students, to know more about it? And I know that imposter syndrome is something that, you know, some people, there's lots of research that shows how it works, but some people are also kind of coming out and saying, I don't know if we should be putting that kind of idea in people's heads. So just interested in hearing, if you talk about it, what you think about it, and how it plays out. Whomever would like to go first.
Yeah, Genevieve, you want to go ahead? Okay, Genevieve's pointing at me. Okay. So we do talk about imposter syndrome in the book and share examples of those moments when we ourselves felt it. And to this day, right, part of the challenge is, or part of what I've learned, you know, in just my years of being a faculty member and now as an administrator and leader at the university, is you still have those moments when now I'm back in a space where I walk into a room and I might be the only Latina again. And I haven't experienced that since, you know, I was, you know, growing up in Bolingbrook. And you have to take a big gulp and sit at the table and put your voice out there, ask the questions, right? And so now whenever I have those moments of self-doubt, because of my years of experience, I'm able to recognize it as that's what it is, and to silence that part of the doubt or anxiety that creeps up. But our message in the book absolutely is that to understand that it's systemic. It's part of us navigating a culture that is very unfamiliar. that it's not an individual experience, that everyone has moments of feeling imposter syndrome. And again, the challenge is learning to recognize it so that you don't let it kind of overwhelm you and inform how you respond, right? And we also try to share that it's we do share that it's part of something called socialization theory, right? That anytime anyone enters a new phase of their journey, whether that's professional or personal, being in that new state always feels unfamiliar and unsteady. And am I right for this? Am I ready? Right. But that is the moment in which we grow and learn and can push ourselves to do the next thing that we're here to do. So, part of it is knowing it's not just you, and also embracing some of that discomfort and saying, you know what, like I've got other assets and skills that I'm bringing here, other things I can draw upon. I've got a community that I can talk to say, did you ever feel this way? Or I had this moment in class, and together we help each other navigate and push through that.
Yeah, and I would build on what Magdalena said. I think she shared it really beautifully, and I think the other part of this is, in terms of some of like the specific advice that we give, is to really surround yourself, both by people who support you, by like, yes, you can do it, you got this, like don't get, how do you say it in English? Like desanimada, like don't get demoralized, don't, right? Like, so surrounding yourself by people who like believe in you and are cheering you on, but also supporting yourself with people who care enough about you to give you critique, right? Who are invested enough in your success to say like, yes, let me read this chapter that you've written, and hey, let's sit down and talk about the ways that this could be better, right? And sometimes those are the same people, and sometimes it's not the same people, right? There are some people who are going to be great as your cheerleaders, but who are not going to give you that sort of in-depth critique. And sometimes we think that finding folks who support us just means the cheerleaders, but we also talk a lot about the importance of critique and the way to receive critique, how to think about critique. And so much of that is, I think, important in terms of thinking about the way that we navigate the institution. There is this structure that creates these feelings of otherness and imposter syndrome. And also, as we navigate that, we also need to simultaneously be navigating our own development and how we get better at every turn, not because we're not good enough, but because we all need to get better, right? Because we all need to develop. And so trying to think about that in a balanced way, in hopes that will give students something really concrete to think about and to move forward on.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate the very nuanced response to that question too. So, you know what? There are so many questions in the Q&A that I think I'm going to hop over there. And then if we have more time, I'll come back. Are you all okay with that? Because there's just so many good questions. So here's one. What is the impact you have seen or noticed with your book so far? And where would you like it to go? I love that question. What do you think?
It's been really lovely. It's been really, really lovely. We've actually given a lot of book talks at institutions across the country. And I think one of the things that has really stuck out to me is I think for so each time we do this in various places and various different kinds of institutions and with various different groups, we often hear reflected back to us like, I really wish that this had existed 15 years ago when I was navigating graduate school, and now I'm in a position to support graduate students, and I'm reading this from that vantage point, and so I think it's really speaking to a multiplicity of audiences, which is what we had hoped for. I think the other thing that's been really interesting, particularly when we've had the opportunity to do talks in person, is it gets very emotional. And in many ways you could think that like a book about like navigating graduate school is like very dry, very unemotional. Like the idea of that just feels very operational. And when we've had the opportunity to connect with folks, so much emotion comes forward. And I think that's about you know, finally seeing, I mean, what some folks are saying in the Q&A of like seeing this, the people's own experiences reflected, you know, more broadly, giving voice to some of the things that many of us have navigated. What you shared, Mary Beth, is, you know, we're hearing this over and over, like somebody said the same thing to me about bringing my kids, you know, and I think that that was something that I it was certainly emotional to write in many ways. And Magdalena and I often talked about that, but it wasn't something that I fully anticipated would be so emotional to talk about with people, and just being able to see people connect with it, see the need for it, voice, you know, how important it is for it to be in the world, has been truly a really, really lovely experience.
And I just like to add something that I recall from the process of writing this book and working with Duke is, you know, they send the manuscript to anonymous reviewers. And one of them said, this is the type of book that is sorely needed, but also the type of book that is frowned upon by many, you know, institutions for not centering research results, being the kind of typical monograph. And so just thinking about that tension and like who we are as faculty members navigating this career trajectory, you know, what are our spaces to put out something really different that is needed to transform the academy, and it doesn't look the typical way that, you know, a book that's going to get you tenure is going to look and sound, right? And you know what, something we wanted to do, and I think the reason why a lot of people connect to the book and are really excited about it is because it's just written like as if we were talking to you. You know, one of our early readers said this feels like two if you've got two madrinas or like godmothers who just sit you down and, you know, with a cafecito and are just giving you some real talk about what the graduate experience is like, the stuff that you don't typically hear in the classroom. And that's been so gratifying to think about, well, to be able to put something out there that we wish we also would have had back in the day when we were navigating this.
Yeah, I really like that. And I'm glad that you said that too. And I one of the things I heard through the whole presentation is just, I think it's really good advice that we don't necessarily have to accept all of these things that have been happening, that, you know, sometimes you can you can be in the position to push back at them or change them, or I like your approach to doing things a little bit differently. So here's a question. Have you ever thought about getting the book translated into Spanish?
Somebody asked us about that, I think in the last talk we did, Magdalena. I can't even remember what context it was in. So, you know, we haven't at this point. I think it's a pretty heavy lift to do so, but it's something we would be open to exploring. I think, you know, somebody also asked in the Q&A, you know, do you recommend sharing this book with like non-Latina advisors or people who are working with grad students? And I think there's a similar, I raised that because there's a similar point of connection here, which is that actually in the editing process, and we work with some really fantastic editors at Duke University Press, and in the editing process, there was a point when one of the editors came to us and said, you know, hey, what do you think about adding a subtitle to the book that is, you know, the Latinx Guide to Graduate School, a handbook for everyone? And we were like, you know, we like the spirit of it. And also like, we don't want to pretend like it's something that it's not, you know? And as soon as you say it's a handbook for everyone, like you kind of open yourself up to critique for the ways that it's not a handbook for everyone. And so, so in some ways, I think, you know, I think both of us would be open to that. Also trying to think in very realistic ways about, you know, of course, there are Spanish speaking audiences here in the US, but also a book translated into Spanish would probably need a foothold outside of the country as well. And navigating higher ed in other contexts, you know, it is a different context, and we wouldn't want to sort of overpromise for what we know and what we can speak to. And in the same way, you know, like, yes, we think that other folks absolutely can get something out of the book, whether it's other graduate students who are not Latinx or Latina, or whether it's, you know, folks who are supporting graduate students who are from other communities. We think it speaks broadly to sort of, you know, marginalized communities, you know, in general. And at the same time, we are conscious to not sort of overpromise, and when we don't want to pretend like it is that is for somebody that we, you know, don't understand the intricacies and the nuances of the way that those communities navigate the institution as well.
And along those lines, you know, we're very purposeful in the book about not describing a kind of monolithic Latinx community, right? So there's such a variety of cultures and experiences, again, under this much broader umbrella. And so coming back to the use of Spanish, we do sprinkle Spanish throughout the text and have it in subheaders and like, places here and there. But, we know that it's to do so in a way that is just to be oppositional in some sense to the academy, or to acknowledge the use of Spanish in our cultures, but that not to say that everyone speaks it. I myself come from a family that spoke only English in the home. I had to learn Spanish in school, right? And so again, just thinking about all the different ways there are to be Latinx, and what are ways that we can signal to some folks like, yeah, we get it, and here's words that are familiar to you, or ways, some things that can only be really captured in a certain way in another language like Spanish. But don't assume that we are thinking like, oh yeah, to read this, there's a certain checkbox, checklist of kind of attributes or things that you as a reader probably do. Like, it's totally open.
Great. So here's another question. First, I wanted to there's a nice little comment. Just wanted to say thank you. It's been a joy to see people who look just like me give such an amazing workshop. So I just wanted to share that with you. Here's the question. What advice do you give to first-gen Latinx students pursuing PhD programs at primarily white institutions? How are they different from Hispanic serving institutions that offer PhD programs?
And that's a really critical question. And it gets back to even the term Hispanic Serving Institution, right? And for folks who may not be familiar with it, an Hispanic Serving Institution, or HSI, is a federal designation for institutions that have 25% or more of their full-time students who identify as Latinx. And there's a real big difference between Hispanic or Latinx enrolling and Hispanic serving, right? And a lot of institutions are searching for how do, part of the thing is oftentimes an HSI status is driven by demographic changes over the years, right? And so it's not that a lot of institutions had at the core of their identity being an HSI, like in a way that, say, a historically Black college or university might be founded around that idea, right? And a very different history and trajectory of how they came to that identity. HSIs are now something new that institutions are aspiring to or acquiring. And so what is the work that has to be done among faculty, staff, and administrators to integrate that identity into their day-to-day work? Do the policies of our campus reflect the current needs and strengths of our student population, right? Which is rising in Latinx demographics. So I'm all excited now, like getting on my soapbox about HSIs. That's something that I really enjoy talking about. And I'm part of a team at San Jose State that has been very grounding, because we're doing work to think about what does being an HSI mean and look like for San Jose State in particular. So I'm totally losing track of the comment, but it's just, it's about our experiences in these places. So I would say, no, there isn't necessarily a large difference between a predominantly white institution and an HSI, because again, so many faculty and staff, administrators have been trained in a certain way and maybe haven't had the opportunity to really stop and question or understand how is it that we make that shift to support the students who we have now, to have a more assets-based approach, not looking at our students with a deficit lens, but rather what are the strengths and values that they bring that help them be successful academically and inform the really great work that they are here to do beyond the degree, right? But being part of a larger community. Genevieve, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, and I think the other part of this, in terms of the question, is sort of what the heart of the question, I think, is sort of what kind of advice do we give to, graduate students of color, Latinx graduate students who are in an environment where they are maybe an only in their class and only in their program, and only in their school, or one of few. And I think, the book has various advice that would tackle various parts of that. But I think probably the biggest and most important piece of advice would be find your people. Find your people, like And maybe that means that you have to go outside of your department. And maybe that means that you need to go outside of your program. And maybe that means that you even need to go outside of your university community, right? But find your people, because that's going to ground you. And that's not to say that you're not going to be able to find meaningful connections with white faculty, with white students, with, folks from other backgrounds. But also it is to say that, like, if there is a part of you that is feeling like you need to connect with your people, don't hush that. Don't think that must be something that's wrong. Like, find your people. And that may be going to the graduate diversity office that has, students from all over the campus. It may be engaging in community work. When I was in graduate school, part of why I took an almost full-time job is because I was struggling with the racial demographics of the School of Education. And I wanted to be in closer proximity to big groupings of students of color. And so I took a job at a scholarship program that was working with undergraduate students at UC Berkeley who are Black, Latinx, and Native. And I took this job really largely. I mean, I needed some extra money. I didn't have kids yet at that point. This was early on in my graduate career, but a little bit of extra money is always helpful. But also a big part of why I took that job is because I was like, I need to be around and in community with, like, folks of color navigating higher education. And this school is not doing it. And being able to play that role of a mentor, of a supporter, of an advisor to Black, Latinx, and Native undergraduate students, it anchored me in a way that was fundamental to my undergraduate years, to the point that I thought it would be a job that I took for maybe a year, and I worked there for 8 years through the vast majority of my graduate program. So yeah, that's a roundabout way of saying, but like, if there was just one piece of advice I was going to give to a Latinx student who is navigating a PWI, it's like, find your people, do whatever you need to do to be able to find your people. And you may find that who your people are shifts and grows, right? It may be that you didn't grow up with close proximity to other communities of color, but in this new context, other students of color, other BIPOC students are also your people, right? And so being able to be open and to be inviting, and also to not be bashful about saying and prioritizing that need.
Thank you. Okay, so I think this is an interesting question. Do your institutions implement best practices that support grad students that align to your book? That's an interesting one. What do you think?
Oh boy. Okay. I think they do in pockets, in different disciplines. Different colleges have different student demographics or different aspects of, largely at San Jose State, it's predominantly master's programs. We do have a number of doctoral programs that we've been growing that, interestingly, are more applied doctoral programs in health sciences, for example. But, it's thinking about, how does this change take place? And I think it circles back to something I think I saw in the questions submitted about what are our kind of individual spaces to begin making change or connect with folks who are interested in similar questions. And so, again, returning to how Genevieve and I first got connected, I will share that in my home department of Mexican American Studies at the time, we had the faculty were expressing some concerns about graduate student writing. And Genevieve, one of the things I remember when I first met her that really struck me was, she was like, okay, I hear that, and I see, some of the students' areas of growth when it comes to writing at the graduate level. She created on her own a 3-part workshop about different aspects of writing that she hosted at her own home, like for students, right? And the first part was about embracing your identity as a writer, and to understand that writing blocks and anxieties that every writer has them, and how to identify them so that you can learn to manage them and get past them to do the work. Another session was about macro editing, organizing your essays very thoughtfully. And then the final session was about micro editing. So I had been on a fellowship leave that year. And when I heard about these workshops, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like, I want to be a part of this. So Genevieve and I started a writing clinic in the department, where it's like, hey, we're going to post up at the library on these days, these hours, working on our own stuff. If you've got an essay that you want some help with, to consult with us, come on by. If you just want to be around other writers and typing together, we could do that. And after Genevieve left for University of San Francisco, I was just so inspired by this kind of model she set up. I integrated those workshops into my intro to graduate, the intro class in the graduate program. And then we grew that to change, for example, our new graduate student orientation. For many years, it was a really short 2-hour meet and greet the day before classes started. And a lot of students left that feeling like, I don't know that I actually understand, really got oriented very much of the program. I still have a ton of questions. So we transformed it into a day-long series of workshops that actually covers a lot of the ground we talk about in the book. Like, what does it mean to map out your semester, to understand and plan out your assignments? What does it look like to write at the graduate level? How do you prepare for class when you're reading on your own, taking notes, and then translate those into questions and comments that you can share with your peers in class? Just trying to show like a peek behind the curtain. This is how we do some of the work. And also framing it as, you don't come here as a blank slate. You have skills, study tips, ideas that other people have given you that you've already honed over the years. Today is about putting them all in the center of the table and everyone picking up and trying out a new tool, right? But we're all here to contribute to this. So all this to say, at, say, my institution, it's like, how do we share this model out and connect with other departments, other universities that are interested in doing similar work? And that is how some of this transformational change starts to grow.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. And I hope, people are listening, just how all the different, especially if they're in administrative positions, all the different kinds of ways that you went about making some structural change, because I think that's really important. So lots of positive comments in here. I think this is a really interesting question. Do you recommend sharing this book with non-Latin graduate advisors? If yes, how would you recommend engaging in this conversation with them?
Yeah, I think the book is legible to folks in various contexts. And I think if we are earnest in our attempts and interest in supporting Latinx, students and other BIPOC students and students of color, then we are going to need to speak to advisors of different backgrounds, because that is the reality of the sort of face of higher ed, right? I also think that there are ways in which the way we've structured the book, there's also reflection questions at the end of each chapter. And this also goes to, one of the questions in the Q&A is about if we would ever develop a curriculum or something like that. We think that the reflection questions are a helpful starting point for really anybody who wants to use this as a tool. And that we do think that it speaks sort of broadly to the experience, and there will be some different sort of, finagling required, but we do think that it speaks to various capacities and various positions. Also, my computer lost battery really rapidly, so I'm gonna run really quickly and get my power cord. But I am still here.
Great. All right, Magdalena, did you have anything you wanted to add there? I'll move on to the next question if not.
Yeah, sure. Let's move on to the next question.
Okay, so I think this is sort of interesting. Have you seen your work in challenging the established rules? How have you seen your work when challenging the established rules land when you're doing your work or advertising your book? So like the idea of challenging the established rules, what has been the fallout or pushback or maybe embracing of doing that? What has that been like? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And, this is not even just with this book, but thinking about work around diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice and belongingness that I and my colleagues have done at the institution and beyond in different conference spaces, et cetera. I would say, right, with anything, there's folks who kind of fall into different camps, right? There's always the folks who are cheerleaders and already there, and they're like, yes, we've been waiting for this, we're ready to jump in. They embrace it with enthusiasm and are like, okay, I got the book, I'm ready to roll this forward, I'm going to read this with my students, I'm going to create a reading group, etc. And that's always great. there's a chunk of folks that I think are really open to it, and maybe just they know they have different, maybe need to shift up their approach or have things to learn, and they also welcome the book and this kind of work, because it's like, cool, yeah, we're all here on it. When it comes to DEIJ work, right, we're all on a spectrum of experiences, always with something new to learn. People are different phases of their journey, right? And so when they get a new resource, a tool, they're like, great, I'm going to read this. I'm going to really start to reflect and think about, how do I integrate this into my practice? Now, inevitably, there's always, I think a small number of folks that are resistant for sure and very skeptical. And it's really part of moving the work forward is about using the folks that are already on board, the cheerleaders, the folks who are open and want to be involved in the conversation, need some support and guidance as they do so. It's like, hey, this is the way that the university is moving. This is the direction we're headed. And whoever wants to be on this, like, great, come join us. We're here to do the work together, and that's how the folks who are very resistant, start to take a hint that it's like, man, you're behind the times if you're not engaging in this way, if you're not taking an assets-based approach to students. But it's frustrating for sure, because, I'm thinking of an experience I had a few months ago of participating in a big institute for institutional leaders around understanding student assets. And still coming out of that, there were folks who listened to the whole presentation and like heard student voices and whatever, and came away saying, yeah, but there's a lot of students that just don't want to do the work. And it's like, okay, you know what? I'm not going to waste my time trying to convince you of something that I just gave you all the facts of and evidence of. If you're not moved by that, I don't know what to tell you, but this conversation is moving on, and too bad you can't join us, right? But it's not going to stop us.
Yeah, thank you. That actually connects to another question. And I think this question is really interesting, especially, it's about frustration, right? How do you maintain professionalism? And that can be broadly defined, right? When you're filled with frustration from the pushback in your community academia work. How do you do that? And I'm sure you have examples of this. What do you think? How do you maintain professionalism when you just want to blow up sometimes?
I'm like, am I the one to answer that? I'm not sure. I think that to me, what it comes down to is actually very similar feedback that I give to students in a similar situation, right? This is what I try to channel for myself as well, which is that, and very much building on what Magdalena just shared, the reality is that there will be some folks who are coming from a place of ignorance and are open to being educated and are interested in collaboration. And then there'll be some people who are coming from a place of ignorance and they're really invested in that ignorance and they're really attached to that ignorance and they really are fond of that ignorance. And it's not to say that those folks are always a lost cause, but it is to say that we have to be thoughtful about where we put our energies, and where we put our energies into. And I think in terms of sort of maintaining sort of professionalism in those moments, and I say this, I also want to acknowledge that I'm answering this question, as somebody who lives in California, who, works at a Jesuit institution where there is sort of a social justice mission. This is a different question for somebody who is navigating the higher ed landscape in Florida right now or Texas right now, right? And I want to acknowledge that like my location is a privileged location in terms of sort of what that kind of resistance or ignorance can look like, because the kind that I encounter and navigate and deal with and confront is going to be very different than what some of my colleagues in other states have to confront, particularly in this moment. But what it comes down to for me is, as I said, kind of what I share with students as well, which is like, we got to keep our eyes on the prize, right? Is that sometimes you have to acknowledge that stuff and you have to engage with it. And sometimes you have to say that's noise. And actually what I'm actually trying to do is X, Y, and Z. And I'm going to stay trained on doing X, Y, and Z. And the noise in the background is noise in the background. And we need to sort of relegate it as such. That is absolutely easier said than done. And there are times in which the folks who are giving you pushback are people who are in charge of resources. And there are times when the people who are giving you pushback are people who are in charge of your own vulnerability in the institution. And that's hard to navigate. And the only thing really we can do in that situation is like, keep our eyes focused on what we're trying to do, understand that this entire sort of struggle is much bigger than any of us, right? It's much bigger than any of us in our positions and our work. And it's about really a transformation of the institution. And, you know, the task of taking on that work is absolutely overwhelming, because it's huge. And also, we each do what we can to wake up every day and to move the needle a little bit more forward.
And to add to that, I'm glad Genevieve brings up our positionality in terms of being in California, right? And being the Bay Area, and our ability at our institutions to speak out, to do the work we do, and have it be positively receptive and positively received, and have support for doing it. You know, that's important to acknowledge. But this question is so important, and I want to share something that I heard a Latina college president say once, that part of it is, she called it having to cultivate at times your Mona Lisa face of like, you know, placidity and being unruffled, even when you're boiling with rage inside. And it's interesting, you know, across this journey, now I come to this question in my administrative role, having to be very attuned to the nuances of power. And there are times that in my role, I would love to possibly snap back at someone, but have to be mindful of the power dynamics at play, you know, in my role as a senior leader, and maybe engaging with a faculty member or a student. It's like, you know, it's tough. It's a fine line to navigate. And how do you provide some feedback, context that can help the situation? At what point do you have to pull back from that because things have become too heated? Maybe this is not the moment. A phone call is better than an email. Like, how do you just learn how and where to say what you have to say? And one other aspect of this is learning how not to take things personally, which is very hard when the work is very personal, because it's personally meaningful and you're very invested in it. You've developed an expertise in it. You're devoting your life to it. So whenever you get that pushback or, you know, kind of critique, it can feel like they're attacking me. And let's be real, sometimes they may be doing that, but lots of times it's like I have to remind myself, you know what, they don't know me. Actually, they don't know who I am as in my full life as a person, the other parts of things I'm here to do on this earth. And I'm gonna step back and give myself some time and space. And to be real, I've got a set of homegirls that when I put out the bat signal, like they are there, and that's the people who I vent to or really give the peace of my mind, and the folks who are there just to listen and affirm, like, no, you weren't off base in interpreting it that way, and who kind of are grounding and help you laugh and be like, okay, I'm going to refocus and then come back refreshed, and here's how I'm going to tackle the problem the next day.
Thank you. Thank you. I love all that advice. And speaking of that, there's a question here of, what is something that you wish someone told you when you were in our shoes? And this is being asked by someone who's in graduate school or looking to go to graduate school. So what's one piece of advice that you would give people?
I think for me, it would be the doubt is going to creep in. It doesn't mean that you did something wrong. It doesn't mean that you don't belong. It means that you are walking a path that not a lot of us have walked. But when that doubt creeps in, find ways to like re-clarify for yourself what you're doing there, why you're there. Connect with the folks who are going to be able to lift you up and cheer you on, and keep on the path. You know, I think that there is, to me, what it often comes down to, and why we see students either walk away from programs or walk away before they complete, or even, you know, put off applying year after year, is because they are sort of saddled with the doubt that is socially constructed. And so being able to put that in a frame for folks, being able to say, look, there's a reason that you feel this way, and it's actually not about you and your deficiencies. Like, keep on, keep your head up, know that the doubt is something that all of us struggle with, and find ways to get support to be able to push through when that stuff creeps up.
Yeah, I would say something along very similar lines of stick with it. Or you were drawn to this pathway to being in a graduate degree program for a reason. What's the why that is at the center of who you are? What's ways in which you can connect the things you're reading, what you're learning, the skills you're picking up to something that is really meaningful to you personally in the world and that you can be a part of. To know that you absolutely belong, that you have a unique voice and perspective that others can learn from, right? And that you're here to learn from other folks' unique perspectives. But higher ed is a great place when you find your people and are engaging together in a shared purpose. Like that is, I honestly show up for work so happy every day because I'm so connected here with a group of close colleagues that we're doing work around and publishing work on stuff we're doing on our campus around supporting Latinx and other historically underserved students. It's like, yes, like I love it. I show up every day. These people have my back. I have theirs. Like, know that that is possible. And if you're feeling alone or having these doubts, don't think it's because you're on the wrong path. Maybe, there's parts of that institution that aren't letting you express your whole self or the thing you can fully be. And there's like, well, I don't even know how many hundreds of colleges and universities across the US, there is a place for you at one of them where it's like, yes, this is my intellectual and professional home where I can grow things and be part of really meaningful conversations. So, it's just, how do we help you find that and support each other in that search?
Thank you. Thank you. Just so the audience knows, we have about 6 minutes left and we have never received this many questions on any of the webinars that we've done. We get a lot, but not like this. So I'm trying to get through all the questions. I probably only have time for a couple more, but here's one that I think is interesting. I appreciate your point that you do not need to relinquish who you are to navigate higher education spaces. And we've been talking a lot about that. Any feedback on how to discuss this with peers that are people of color from your community and feel estranged from you because you have pursued alternative paths that are white centered?
Ooh, we need a lot more than 6 minutes for that one.
I know. But it's a good one. That's a good question.
It's a great question. And we actually do talk about this in the book. We talk about, we had, we started out with a chapter about navigating relationships in graduate school. And we were going to put everything in there, right? How do you navigate relationships with advisors? And, and then also, how do you navigate relationships with your friends who are not in graduate school? And, and then we realized actually that we needed to sort of separate this out. And we developed an entire chapter on personal relationships, which includes your relationships with your friends that grew up on the same block as you, and your relationship with your children, and your relationship with your parents. And the reason I say it takes more than 6 minutes is because there's no easy answer to this, right? There are ways in which you are separate. You are on a different path. And as much as we want that to not be the case, right? There is a way in which navigating this context does reshape and reshuffle things. At the same time, right, we think it's really critically important to hold on to those relationships, to be able to be honest about the points of juncture and disjuncture in those relationships. And many of us, are navigating, caretaking, not just for children, but for, elderly family members, or, your uncle who needs you to go with him to the bank so that you can translate when you're in line, or, whatever the case may be. There are ways in which your own sort of walking this path in academia might feel a disjuncture to folks in your community or folks in your family. There's how we deal with that are a couple different things, right? Part of that is about how we think about and make legible our work to people who have no context for graduate education. That's actually something that's important for all of us as academics to do. The other part of it is actually really checking ourselves and thinking about, are there ways in which I'm actually replicating some of the sort of elitism of the institution that is unnecessary? And like, I'm navigating this 38 hours of the week, and then I'm with my mom 2 hours of the week. So it makes sense that there's spillage, but also like, how do I have a kind of position that is reflective and that is thoughtful, so that I can make sure that I'm also checking myself in sort of my interactions with folks outside of the institution, and ensuring that I'm still providing places to connect, that I'm still showing up as me, as the same nephew, as the same son, as the same, parent, even though I'm also in many ways in navigating this whole other context, speaking a whole different language, trying to find my footing in a place that is very foreign from the place that I come from.
Yeah, I'll just add that sometimes I've been taken aback by how inadvertently I might say or do something that is jarring to other folks. And I was just thinking, a funny memory popped up of, even in one of my graduate courses that I was teaching, we were going to have an end semester, party to wrap up. And I said, okay, I'll bring crudité. And the students just looked at me like, what is that? I'm like, the carrots, and the celery, and that you put in dip. And they were like, why didn't you just say that? Like the veggie platter, I'm not even trying to be fancy, saying like, oh, I'll bring crudité. I don't know about you folks, but right, there's moments in which, taking back to the question, it's like that we learn to code switch, right? There's things that you're learning and have access to that, in a way, it's a good challenge. Like sometimes I've encouraged students, okay, let's take, a concept, we're reading about hegemony. If you had to break this down to your imagine you have a 13-year-old cousin that's like, hey, what's that book about? What are you studying? How would you explain this to them? And that's actually a really helpful exercise in like, how do we break out of academic jargon and specialized ways of speaking to make like certain concepts or ideas more accessible and easier to, to understand for everyone. You know what I mean? It's like, because it's really interesting ideas that could help maybe that young cousin talk about something they're experiencing in school, right? But being in conversation, it's like, how do we, it's like going back to Genevieve's point, right? Just kind of not assuming that knowledge only comes from one place, that critical questions and inquiry are only located in the space of the institution. Like family members, your friends that you grew up with and stuff, like just talking about different ideas, like they bring such good questions and perspectives and critique. And it's like, how does that make you really interesting to interact with when you're in class, and you bring this up like, hey, a lot of people might say this, and then like break it down. And right, how do we build bridges through our code switching and ability to access language from different kinds of cultures and places, contexts, and merge them? These are some of our superpowers, right? And Gloria Anzaldúa, a Chicana theorist, has a concept of nepantla, right? Of folks who straddle multiple worlds. And that's a stressful experience at times, to be sure, but then that is also one of our biggest sources of strengths, that we have access to multiple cultures, ways of talking, ways of presenting ourselves, and can use that very strategically to represent different aspects of our identities and knowledges in different spaces.
Thank you. Thank you. And you remind me that my mom, who has very, very little education, gave me one of the best pieces of advice ever. And that is, don't tell everyone your secrets. And that is a good piece of advice for the academy as well. So I always go back to her saying that. She's like, keep some things to yourself, So I want to say thank you. We still have so many questions in the chat, but we do have to continue on with the day. I want to say thank you so much to Magdalena and Genevieve. Thank you so much for being with us, for writing this amazing book, for answering all of those questions and your presentation. And just a reminder to everyone that we are recording this, so we will be sharing it with all of you. We also are offering that discount code, which is in the chat, and giving 30% off. We also will be picking 3 people to get autographed copies of the book, and once we pick those, we'll email you and send those out. And thank you so much to the Proctor Institute and to our team, Giselle and Natalie, who did a lot of behind the scenes work on this program as well. That's all we got. That's a wrap. Thank you, everybody. Take
Thanks
good care.
So much.